Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of BIM Pure Live. I am your host, Nicolas Catelier. I am an architect, a BIM specialist, the founder of Revit Pure and BIM Pure. BIM Pure Live is a show where we help you become a better Revit and a better BIM user. And we have very special guests with us today. But before moving on with the guests, a couple of things to talk about. First, hello to people in the chat. We've got Simone from Italy. We've got Ogofi from Botswana. We've got Mania from Iran. We've got Luis from Portugal. Ian from Kansas. So hello to everybody. Thanks for joining the show. And BIM Pure Live this season is sponsored by Enscape. And for me, it's a no-brainer. I've actually asked Enscape if they would sponsor the show because I love their product. It's a no-brainer for me to recommend Enscape. It's a visualization tool that works with Revit, but also with Rhino and SketchUp. And yeah, I just love this tool so much. And I thought that I would do a weekly series. Each week I talk about a different feature of Enscape. And this week I've decided to talk about the feature of the day is the asset library, the assets collection that is included with Enscape. And that's something that used to be lacking in Enscape, quite frankly. There wasn't that much asset, but in recent patches there's a lot. And you can see there's this checkbox at the bottom, offline asset library. Make sure to check that and it will make your library much faster. So in this case, you can see we're placing a few different assets. It looks different when you're in the Revit model, but that's something that is different from Revit to other software rendering tools is that you place the assets directly in your Revit models. You don't have to place them in another tool. As you can see, we placed a few people in there. A couple of people, a cyclist, and why not a car, an ambulance. So we're placing this vehicle in the Revit model. And something else that I want to talk about as well is that you want to control the asset's visibility. And for that, I use the design option. I create a new design option with a couple of options. And this way, it's just to make sure that these assets will not be visible in the main Revit construction documents. I don't want them to pollute my model. So I create a new design option. And one of them is called No Assets. It is the primary option. And another one is called Assets. And I make sure that all these elements are placed in the Assets option, which is turned off by default. I used to use work sets to accomplish this, but I tried to use work set as little as possible. I prefer design option these days for that. So in this view, you can just turn on the assets for the design option to ensure that they are visible. So let's bring this view to Enscape and see what happens. You can see these assets are there, the cyclist, the lady, and the ambulance. And they will not pollute your Revit model because we place them in a design option that is turned off by default. So that's the Enscape feature of the day. Another reason why I love using Enscape, this beautiful asset library. All right. So thanks Enscape for sponsoring this season. And Revit Pure pamphlets. I've started releasing guides about some of Revit's most complex features, including work sets, 3D views, finishes, line weights, PyRevit, phases, railings, floor system, groups, family visibility, and much more. And you can download the entire collection for free at revitpure.com/pamphlets. You can get all PDFs. And we've had more than 35,000 downloads since the beginning of Revit Pure. So it's all free, revitpure.com/pamphlets. All right, so these are my little notes. Let's introduce the guests. Today's guest is Clive Jordan. Clive is currently based in Irvine, California. He's originally from the UK, where he completed a master's degree in civil engineering. He's the co-founder and CEO at Plannerly since 2017. Plannerly is a BIM management platform, combining BIM planning, information requirement, project tracking, and ISO 19650 standards compliance. Before that, he worked at the Irvine Company, at Trimble, at Vico Software, and at Graphisoft. So, welcome to the show, Clive.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
How are you doing?
Doing great. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing a bit more about your passion in software. I love it when people start with software, and Enscape. Yeah, great product. Great product.
Yeah, I love it. I'm glad that they're sponsoring. So I wanted to start. And typically, I ask my guests, "How did you get interested in BIM?" With you, I'll ask, "How did you get interested in BIM standards?"
Wow. Well, I suppose it starts with getting interested in BIM. I'm a civil engineer by trade, I would say. I got interested in building because I was working with my dad all the time. He would build stuff. I remember building workshops down the end of the garden, digging holes, filling them with concrete, bricklaying, and things like that. And I just had such a passion for the industry. And then the first startup that I worked for after being in construction was a technology company with BIM, and that was the Graphisoft tie that you just mentioned. And I realized that combining my passion for engineering and construction with BIM and code was suddenly going to advance our industry. But the standard side of things really came about because if everyone does BIM in a completely different way, it's going to cause more waste and rework. And so we said, how do you standardize? Well, having some standards, and you mentioned ISO 19650 compliance. The headache that is standards, if everyone around the world followed a different standard again, it would be even more confusing, and it wouldn't create that cross-pollination between teams in different countries. And having traveled the world and loving the opportunity to work in different countries, seeing that opportunity for standards to align across all the different countries as well, then yeah, that's why when you say a passion for standards, I don't know, it's a love-hate relationship, because the need to standardize, but also it can be confusing for some as well. Certainly was confusing for me when I first started as well.
Yeah, and you're originally from the UK. How did you end up in California?
Wow. So I left London about 15, 20 years ago. And that was with the Vico software, the startup.
Okay, yeah.
So we were traveling around. We left, we went from London to Dubai, and then to Dubai to Miami, and then Miami to essentially LA or San Francisco. And then this has been home for a while. So yeah, that was the journey through AEC startups around the world.
Good to hear. So I have a list of questions I have about BIM standards, and we're also gonna leave some time to talk about Plannerly. But I thought we'd start with some of this. Well, first, can you talk to me about the difference in BIM standards all around the world? Because I see so much difference. Like, it seems some countries are more advanced in this regard, maybe because of mandate from the government, such as the UK generally seems to be one step ahead of other places with their BIM mandate and their use of ISO 19650. So how do you assess the situation of different BIM standards from all around the world?
I'll start with, everyone thinks that they're behind compared to other countries.
Yeah.
There's always that feeling, no matter where you are. The UK's got a great mandate, as you said, and really has done amazing things to push from the PAS standard into an ISO standard that has now been adopted in lots of different places around the world. But the classic is, even though it's a standard that can be implemented around the world, there's a national annex in each region, which is just like an appendix of how it localizes certain aspects of the workflow. And so even though it's one standard that could be used around the world, everyone could have their own standard. But the standards really came about, maybe the interest came about when we were in the Vico days. We were creating 3D models, and we had to plan for what we wanted. We actually had a team of about 120 people creating models, because our software at the time needed a 3D model, and nobody was creating 3D models. Nobody was doing enough BIM at that point. And so we came up with that first, the LOD standards. And little did we know that it was going to cause confusion around the world, and be adopted and adapted and changed in different ways in around the world, whether it's level of detail, level of development, level of definition, and lots of different ways and scales. But that was originally where standards for BIM kind of came about. And then we started to see the UK went for a level of definition with detail and information as aspects underneath. In the US, the level of development, a lot of around the world, as it still says, level of detail, level of design, level of disillusionment.
Well, I've had Marzia Bolpagni last year on the show, and she mentioned it should be level of information need.
Right.
Because level development, it doesn't necessarily include the information. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, exactly. So inside of, we'll get to it, but we've been focused on supporting all of those standards and also mapping them against each other. And what level of information need does is it creates a framework over all of it that allows you to understand essentially what that geometry might look like, what the information is required, and then what documentation can come from that set of information. So there's a framework that helps to define what's required. And that means that it's more structured. It means that everyone's hopefully going to define the same requirements in the same way. We're working with Building Smart International on the information delivery specification, which makes all of this type of thing then machine readable. And so trying to make it so that it's following the same standard and following ISO standards with level of information need is absolutely the way to go. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about ISO 19650. So if you had to explain in a couple of sentences, what is this norm? Why is it important? Why should we use it? What would you say?
I'd say it's important because it means that everyone would talk the same language. Why is it needed? Because everyone has their own way of doing things at the moment, and that causes waste and rework. And it's not the one thing that I would make clear with everyone, even though it can seem confusing, and I myself, if you read the standards, I have to read each paragraph 17 times. If you boil it down, it's what we do today. We have a workflow that you go through procuring something, and we go through essentially managing and then checking, validating it. That workflow is the same. It doesn't really matter whether it's a project not doing BIM or whether it's a project using a different or an improved information management workflow. It's essentially this ISO framework. It is how do you go about better procuring and better managing and making sure that you've got a workflow that everyone's following and understands. So
let's say that someone hears this and has heard about ISO 19650 but isn't too sure where to start. How can that person get started? Should that person read the whole norm? Should they read kind of a recap of the norm, some sort of summary? So what is the best way to get started?
Definitely don't start by reading every single one of the standards. We've got some great resources on the website that you might want to refer people to. There's a resources page.
Yeah, I'll show you screen. Yeah, we can see the screen now.
Yeah, there's a resources tab, and then on here, ISO 19650, training and certification advice. This button, there's 2 webinar series. One talks about ISO 19650 and how you get templates and everything else. One talks about the training and certification, auditing, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of a bit deeper. And then there's also, we've got some more training here, but there's also a diagram. And this diagram is probably the most simple way to describe it. So go and have a look. There's a few videos on this page as well. But if I looked at the diagram in itself, there's one piece. Here we go. This is how you explain ISO 19650. If you looked at this and said, how are you going to assess what you have, or what your requirements you have, invite people to bid on it, evaluate what's happened as far as what people have bid, agree on what should be in the appointment, as in the contract, and then get it done, and make sure that you're following the workflow and learning from it as you go. They're really the phases, the steps that you go through. And the difference, or the main thing when you think about ISO, is they've got slightly different language than we're used to. So we talk about clients or owners or the main developer, but it's referred to as the appointing party, the person that makes the appointment of the contract, the key, then you've got a lead appointed party, which essentially is the one managing task teams, and then appointed parties underneath. So there's a kind of a trying to be international with the language to make it easier for people to understand. And as you go through this, that person appointing has to understand what they need and define their requirements in a more clear and simple way that everyone's going to understand. And that's following these acronyms, but forget about the acronyms of OIR, PIR, EIR, BEP, etc. And just think of it as this is the set of tender documents or the bid documents. And then you get a list of responders with their BIM execution plans, which are sort of there's a pre and a post execution, pre and post contract, meaning that I can give you my BIM execution plan to answer some of those bid questions and help you understand more about how I'm going to fulfill the requirements you've set. And then when you get into the contract side, that's when you get more detail and you get actually, this is how I'm going to carry out for this project with this team. And in the appointment of that, what are the tasks that my teams underneath me are going to carry out? So even though I say very simple, but essentially it's the same process we're going through, but structuring it and having people even use the same terms for describing who is going through that workflow.
Yeah, I remember when I first came across ISO and tried to read the norms or read about it, was like, what is an appointing party and what is that? Where does that come from? So I eventually learned that basically mean client, and lead appointed parties might be architect or engineer. So it took a while for me to get it. Talk to me. Where is there a mandate in the UK to use ISO 19650?
Yeah, so essentially inside of each region, you'll have mandates and an annex. In the UK, there's a mandate with an annex, and the annex says you will also follow certain file naming conventions and certain status codes that we use for in a CDE, for example, in a common data environment, to say when a file is ready for a certain state and a certain use case. So yeah, in the US, there's a national BIM standards and certain protocols that are there. But when we talk about how well it's defined in the UK, there is actually a protocol for the engagement, for the contract, for the appointments as well. So there's a lot of legal language that has been written really, really well to help with appointing people. Whereas in the US, it's not there, and other countries, it's somewhere maybe in between as well.
So how much is ISO 19650 used in the US then? Is it used a little bit, not at all, medium?
So it's not quite medium. It's a little bit. It's not at all, but it's early days. And one of the things that you'll see is more language. I sit on the BIM committee on the National Institute of Building Sciences, and there is a push to align with the ISO 19650 workflow, not necessarily enforce every single piece of it. And interestingly as well, potentially not go for some of that international naming standard on the appointing party, lead appointed party, etc. So there's different levels of implementation in different countries. Certainly more alignment and more interest in the US, but nowhere near as much as in Europe and some of the countries across in Europe. And we also work with a lot of companies across Australasia as well that are implementing ISO 19650 workflows.
Yeah, that was another of my questions. So we mentioned the US and the UK, but what other countries are using ISO a lot? I think Australia might be. Other than that, you said other European countries?
Yeah, the European countries, but also Canada as well. There has been a push. I think maybe a year ago, I was on a CanBIM
Yep.
event for the push and the launch of ISO 19650.
Hmm.
So that, yeah, the principle is standardize in a simple way. Don't standardize to add more complexity and more confusion.
Hmm.
That's the goal, but it's challenging.
Yeah.
It's certainly it can be confusing.
And you mentioned the annex. Something that I've heard is that, for example, there's the annex to the ISO norm in the UK, which has naming conventions for revisions, for files, and so on. But that's the annex. So when people are saying, are your file names ISO compliance? Well, they're actually referring to the annex, not necessarily to the norm itself, right?
So that annex, yeah, it's like a localized set of requirements in a certain geography. And the we're seeing also some countries saying follow the annex from the UK, like this is what we want you to do. So that can be referenced, but the best thing would be for countries to take a stand and to put their own requirements to specifically their location. It would be great. So there are a few people that are against the concept of an annex because it really doesn't mean that it's standard anymore. It's essentially you've got an overall framework, but then it localizes, which doesn't mean that it's standard, which means that if there's a different way of naming or coding or classifying something in one region, it's not going to transfer to others. And when we talk about that, so you think about what is the status of a document? What can it be used for? They are things that possibly could be standardized around the world in specifically AEC. So why can't we do that? There's arguments about file naming because why should we be creating these ridiculously long file names when actually it should be metadata? And how
Hmm.
do we manage this more efficiently? Yeah. I could plug the CDE where Planoly is looking at no folders and no file names. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It's all the data and filters. And yeah, that's the way that we could and should go, but not everyone is quite there yet. So it's
Yeah,
difficult.
well, 2 weeks ago with Martin Day, we talked about that the future of BIM, if it's entirely on the cloud, maybe there's not even file names anymore. So that would solve the issue. Um,
Yep.
let's talk about BIM execution plans. So there are some BIM execution plans that might be ISO 19650 compliance and others that might not necessarily be. So um, how do you recommend people get started with BIM execution plans? Should they start with the ISO norm? Let's say, well, it depends where you are, right? If there's a mandate or no. But let's say you are in the US and ISO is not doesn't have a mandate. What template can you use for what template should you use for a BIM execution plan?
There are many, as you said. Yeah. So we've got everything from the Penn State back in whenever 2011, 12 or something like that, that is still being used around the world. We've got the National Institute of Building Sciences releasing a template. We've got Center for Digital Britain and a whole bunch of others that have got templates. We do have some templates as well, and we actually have most of those in here. So if I was to show quickly a project inside of Planoly, you've got all of the templates that you might need for ISO and a bunch more, all out of the box. So if you wanted to follow Penn State's, or if you wanted to follow certain other templates in other countries and other languages, you can. The BIM execution plan template here, if I add it to Planoly, will then create you a BIM execution plan that follows. And if I open that library again, this is the ISO workflow, essentially, owners defining requirements at an organizational level, understanding what the project implications are, understanding how and what needs to be exchanged for that project. And then the BIM execution plan is really how I'm going to adhere to all of those requirements and those workflows.
Yeah, actually, I'll praise you and I'll say that just scrolling through Plannerly, I've learned a lot from BIM standards because, yeah, on the top left where it says ISO, you can switch from one norm to the other, ISO or the Penn State, as you mentioned, and just look through the document. Oh, okay, that's how it's made in this norm. So in your case, like let's say someone is trying to get their first BIM execution plan. Which one would you recommend? Do you have a recommendation or it depends on too many factors?
So if it was a question without a whole bunch of interaction with that person, I would say start here. So inside of the example templates and obviously with your own language, but
Yeah.
the ISO templates here. And then this BIM execution plan has what you need to understand and fill in. There are things that in here that you would be able to change. It talks about, why we use BIM. Obviously, your reasons might be different, and you might have more or less than what's shown in here. And sometimes you might not need to put that into your BIM execution plan. Do you need to understand coordination and clash detection? What is the process that you're fulfilling here? What are your model delivery or project? How do you go about project coordinates or communication, your meetings, milestones? What standards do you use? All of this is available inside of here to be able to then change if you want to. So, it's a starting point that you can update as you go.
Whose responsibility is it to create this BIM execution plan?
Well, if you have been asked for one by an appointing party or a lead appointed party in that roll-up, then you obviously, it's your responsibility. It's a collaboration, I say. I say that the unfortunate nature sometimes actually in these standards is that everyone's creating a BIM execution plan and they have it in Word. And then when somebody asks for it, they PDF it and send it on an email. And then everyone's got their own and they're all in email or FTP or upload and download everywhere. And nobody's really collaborating on and getting to an agreement. So I would say that everyone should be working on the same BIM execution plan, using an online tool and being able to collaborate. So that's kind of the principle. You might actually, instead of having, one document that's managed by one team, you would invite many teams in here and say, I'm going to assign these sections to certain people so that then you might have multiple people from multiple teams working all over the document and then managing that section and saying only when they're ready to share it or publish it, does it get then into the workflow and authorized for use. So instead of waiting for a whole document to be finished by 10 different companies and then trying to agree on it, it's working on pieces of it with multiple companies and permissions and going through an approval process on each section rather than the whole thing.
So there are BIM execution plans for a different phase of the project. Typically, there can be one from the client, there can be one from during the design phase, and one during the construction phase. How do you deal with that? And is it the same name or it's a different name? Because I'll say here in Quebec, we have a whole naming system that is not ISO. I'm not sure where it comes from exactly, but it's like the one from the client has a specific name, and then one from the design is a different name as well. And I've realized at some point that internationally it's a bit different.
The concept from an ISO perspective is that you have exchange information requirements coming from the owner or the appointing party. And then you would have those teams creating a pre-appointment, pre-contract BIM execution plan. And then you would have a contract BIM execution plan. But I still think that all of those should be the same. As in, if you've got lots of BIM execution plans and they all say something different, but everyone thinks that theirs is the one that everyone's following, then there's problems, there's trouble. And that's the other side to this is if you have a document from an owner, just by adding that as well. So if these are the exchange information requirements, having the exchange information requirements in with the BIM execution plan and understanding that they interrelate and can refer to each other, and even being able to have permissions on these, so I could describe which teams have access to each of those documents. That's where the power of online collaboration comes in. And when you say, there are multiple BIM execution plans, I say there shouldn't be. I think that there should actually be one collaborative online BIM execution plan.
Yeah, well, here typically they would say in the construction phase, like the contractor takes like write BIM execution plan for the subcontractors. So in this case, like the architects, for example, wouldn't be as involved as in the previous one for the design phase. So you say it would still be better to merge them together?
As long as you have permission. So
Oh, okay, yeah, I
inside of
see. Yeah.
here, yeah, we would say, I am going to add a specific team for this document, and they would be the only ones that would see it. And then later you could actually add other teams as they come in and give them permission to see, give them permission to edit, to collaborate, to comment, to agree to. So that principle of going through that workflow is really important. When I first started in BIM, you wonder how you're going to get everyone on the same page, and then this great concept of BIM execution planning comes up, and you think this is how everyone's going to be doing exactly the same thing and going to be following the standards, and everything's going to be perfect. And then you realize nobody reads your BIM execution plan. I've created so many BIM execution plans, and I thought I needed to make a better BIM execution plan. I thought that was the problem. So I kept making it better, making it more visual, making it more, engaging. And then I realized it was so many pages, and I said, oh, it can't be more than 30 pages, so I need to reduce it. And then it came to be, and actually that's a tongue in cheek, it was over 100 pages, maybe at some point. And then I reduced it down to a one pager. So we had a one pager BIM execution plan. And I realized, I thought, oh, that was the problem. It was too much. But actually, it's still not that, because even if it was a one pager, there was supporting information, links to places, and we were still mandating rather than collaborating to get agreement on something. Mm-hmm. And that's what was missing. It wasn't how many pages, or it wasn't, it was literally, it needed to be a collaboration in order for people to put their input in and get to an agreement so that it would then be followed. Mm-hmm. And the sad thing that we realized is actually it's not just BIM execution plans in our industry. It's a whole bunch of other really important documents, like contract documents, like scopes of work. All of that is mandated and sent on an email, on a PDF, rather than truly collaborated, agreed to, and then followed. So yeah, I get pretty passionate. There are some problems in our industry that need some collaboration. So using an online collaborative approach is the only way, I believe.
Yeah, totally. Especially if you assign like teams or people to have a look at the specific areas of the BIM execution plan. I would say my approach for a while, I think I had a template that was similar to the Penn State BIM execution plan, but I had a really minimalist approach. And like you, I thought like it needs to be not too long, else people won't read it. Because I've received in the past like really long BIM execution plans, especially for rather small projects, where it felt that many parts of it were copied and pasted from other projects that were probably bigger in scale. So you get this huge BIM execution plan that it seems, why are we talking about this? Where it's a small project. So my approach has been trying to cut, but then there's also, if there's a mandate, there's a compliance aspect to some norms, so that's supposed to change. But if you have like a tool like this, it might simplify part of it.
When you mentioned there that it's not about copying and pasting from a previous project and then cutting down, it's actually about having a starting point and then saying, oh, you know what, there's a something about our hierarchy of information. We need a project org chart on this project. So then I'm just going to drag from my other project and drop it in and say, I need an org chart. So now that's what I have in my project. And instead of it being taking a long time to manage and cut down, it's an additive approach. So it means that you only add what you need to and for that project. So it's a bit more targeted, for sure.
Yeah, I'm wondering. So we haven't went to the origin of Plannerly. I'm wondering how did Plannerly get started? What inspired you to co-found this tool?
Oh man, well, we have a broken industry, and I thought that I could try and fix it. I worked for a developer, and one of the world's largest developers, and we had a massive, essentially funding to be able to implement BIM across about 30 different companies. And we did a great job, but it took a lot of resource. And we were creating spreadsheets, and we were creating documents, and we were trying to summarize and putting these into web pages. And we were building this kind of network of technology in order to be able to implement this workflow. And so when I thought, oh, nobody else is going to be able to do this, and when I realized how the collaborative BIM execution plan and the online approach needed to be implemented, the only way was to build technology. So yeah, I went back to startup world, and that's the love of tinkering by continually improving based on feedback. We started off with just essentially it was an LOD matrix and a document tool, but now we go right the way through from multiple project documents, and doesn't matter what type of document, to creating out the full scope down to what information requirements are needed by what teams at what times, hooked into the Building Smart Data Dictionary, exporting information delivery specifications, machine readable format, or automating the model checking, connecting to ACC and BIM 360, or jumping and dropping in your model yourself, to now full file management and CDE functionality. And the principle has always been, how do you solve these challenges in the more and more simple way? So that's, we're passionate about being able to combine our love for the industry. I've worn the hat of architect as an intern. I've been a contractor, engineer by education. I've been a developer and owner. And I realized that the way to optimize all of this is that one line of code could then be used by a million people. If we write that line today, they could use it tomorrow. And so the principle behind that combination of our desire to optimize our industry, we're lean junkies as well, lean nuts. We love the concept of lean and being more efficient. And then combining that with BIM and combining it with code, that's what's born Planoly, yeah. And the principle, as it says on the t-shirt, don't plan late, plan early with Planoly. That's the catchphrase. Where it came from.
Yeah, that's the catchphrase. So if I get this in a sense, is the software can help so you don't have to reinvent the wheel or try to find information for each standard each time. With the template, and some of it is pre-populated, you can save time and let the software do part of the work instead of doing it manually each time.
Yeah, templates can save time, but it needs to be kind of thought through. And then if I open this section, for example, Word documents have lots of text in them sometimes to say, replace this, or do this, and then delete this red text type thing. So instead of doing that, we have these placeholders, which we call smart fields. And yes, you can edit everything in here, but these smart fields will remain editable when you share this section. So now if somebody knows the project start date, they can come in and they can enter this start date by selecting it. And then that start date, wherever it's used throughout all project documents, is now filled in. So you don't have to do find and replace everywhere. And this concept of building something that's reusable, but building it in an intelligent and smart way is important here. I think it's even more important when you look at the scope of a project, because if I've done something before and the structural or the architectural work for certain use cases, so here we've got different use cases. If I've done 3D coordination before and I know that I need these elements for structural 3D coordination, then it's simply doing a quick, this is what I now need. And now I'm in my project. I've got all my project assignments with all of my requirements, down to even, things that I need to check off for making sure that these concrete stairs are following my standard and linked to those specifications that are required for that standard.
Yeah.
So, kind of like
there's not just BIM standards. There's also, can you link to Revit models?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you've created yourself a scope, these are the requirements, and maybe there's some information requirements, like this one needs a concrete compression strength. The number needs to be between a certain number, so it's following a rule. Then when we go to the verify module, these cards are all in here, but they're also linked to the elements as well. So anything, if I add a new model, you can see that we can connect it into the Autodesk Construction Cloud. I realize I created this in a free project, so you can't do that in the free project, but you can also drop in anything, Revit models, Navisworks models, IFC files directly in here. And then what will allow you to automatically check those things. So you can see that these foundations are required. And actually, I realized that in that milestone, we didn't require it. So if we did require that, this concrete compression strength in that milestone, and then we go to the model, and then we can see that it evaluates this card, the column foundations, to say that 16 of these foundations have that, and but they don't meet the rule. So the value is not inside of that range, and then 15 of them do. So you can start to understand the quality of the model in relation to the owner's requirements. And then when you're ready, you can export a handover COBie file, for example.
Mm-hmm. So are these, what I'm seeing, is it related to LOD?
Related to that definition of geometry, information, and documentation. So you're creating your exchange information requirements, your set of what do I need, when do I need it, who's going to do it, how, to what extent, and then they're evaluating that model based on those requirements, based on what you've just asked for.
Interesting. Yeah, because in the past I remember having to modify and update an Excel spreadsheet of LOD, and I've always asked myself in this case, do we really need to do this? Is this adding value to the project right now, or is this kind of just bureaucracy? So yeah, what you're saying is it's a more visual way of taking care of this.
If somebody really needs to have something in the model and or some information, we believe that there should be a customer for every one of those cells on that matrix. A lot of people just like fill it all in, not even thinking about what the output is. So that's what's really important when you go through the project scoping. And every single card in that scope then becomes a card in here in the verify that you can then automatically check. So instead of, we were there as well, we would create these LED spreadsheets and it would be useful to nobody. And then it would also be worse for us because we realized that we create a whole bunch of work for checking that it just took so much time. We'd have a spreadsheet open, we have models open, and we try and do this. And then what happens if there's a problem? How do I communicate it to these people? Well, right now you can just say, I app mention somebody, or I share the link to this card, and they go directly to that problem and they can fix it. It makes it so much easier. But there has to be a customer for that. So in the scope, this is where if you don't need something, don't ask for it. There's a very simple way, this is what I would recommend, is getting rid of what you don't need and keeping only what you do need. These are the things that we do need.
So like, let's say things that, the LOD isn't that important, or it isn't something that should be verified during the course of the project. So you can only specify certain specific categories or types of elements.
Yeah, specify what you need. Don't be... There's a lot of times that teams will believe that, that would be great. Or you ask an owner and an owner says, I want a massively detailed model with every single piece of information ever available on my project. Well, that sounds like a great deliverable maybe to them, but it's a painful process and it's probably never going to be opened. So let's not request it in the first place. But if somebody really does need to understand these stairs and to know if they are an internal or external or load bearing or not, or what finish it is, so that they can then maybe maintain it or replace it, then that's important. And that's something that should be added as a requirement, and it should be assigned to a specific team, and it should be automated in the verification process rather than be a burden on somebody else to then have to check later.
I see there are a lot of questions. We're going to get to them soon. First, I had still a couple of things left. Can you talk about COBie? Can you explain what COBie is? It seems like the name of a dog.
Woof, woof. So COBie is an attempt to standardize building information. So for operating a building, and it's just gone into a third revision, or so 2.4 was the latest. Now there's a version 3. It's essentially a format for communicating that information. A lot of people see it as a spreadsheet with color-coded bars. I would definitely recommend, there's a webinar that we did, possibly if you search COBie Planoly on YouTube, you'd find it. But it essentially can then be a way to communicate between the model properties and the owner's information management system. So they have an FM system, a operations system, a system that they use to understand when the warranty is up on something, or when they need to do preventative maintenance on something. And so if you've got an element that needs some information about it, maybe there's well, let's look at something that might, so if there's a mechanical piece of equipment that I add to this project, and if at the asset information model stage, we need to know that there's a warranty and that warranty start date is required, that might be a COBie property that is then in a specific tab in an export of that COBie file. So in the scope, what we're doing is we're saying this HVAC piece of equipment is required in the model at the asset information model handover. And this property is a COBie property that we need in the component spreadsheet tab. And it needs to be in a date format. And when we export that with a model, so if I export this as a handover data in the COBie format, we haven't got a model to populate it, but if that model had those properties, those values would then be listed in the spreadsheet, so that it would be really easy for the owner to see exactly what assets they have, and the data that they had asked for would be populated potentially from the model data automatically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you say for someone that would want to start from scratch to understand COBie, you mentioned a webinar about it.
There is a webinar. I think it's called COBie Made Simple or something like that. It talks through actually how we worked with industry and education to come up with this integration that has specification to a standard and model validation to that, and then export as a COBie file as well.
Okay, and my other question was a bit related to that as well. Is that, so we're having a 1 hour session. What are the best sources if someone says, like, I want to spend a couple of days, but really dig deep into BIM standards. I want a complete course to understand everything about it. What are the best sources? I know you have a lot of resource about it. What do you recommend?
I'd recommend that they register their interest on this course here. There's in the resources tab, there is a training course, and this training course goes through from the basics of information management all the way through to expert with ISO 19650 workflows as well. This would be highly recommended, and it's new. It's coming very soon, so register for that. There's a bunch of others I can recommend. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes. Is there a place for some of these as well?
Yeah, I'll add them to the YouTube description.
Okay.
So, but this, what I see right now, people go to plannerly.com, and on resource, they should see it.
Yep. Okay. This is available there. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, I think we went through most of my questions, but there's a lot of questions from the audience now. So let's have a look at that. There's questions and comments. Catherine Kruger says, my motto for developing standards, Mike the right way, the easy way. From Ethel Elvin, hi Clive, thanks for being here. Is the aim of the ISO 19650 to supersede existing regional BIM standards, or to be used in conjunction with? Is there a BIM contract structure proposed by ISO? So I guess the question is, like, there's local laws and standards. How do you integrate that with ISO? Is it on top of it? Is it alongside it?
Yeah, so certainly doesn't just replace everything that's going on today. I think that the best way from a regional perspective is to say ISO 19650 aims to standardize. We have ways to do things today. Merging those together and formalizing it with a national annex is the right way to do it from a country's perspective. And that's how those regional current steps or standards or workflows can be incorporated into the standard. And then people can say, we're following ISO 19650, but it also merges in some of the great work that they've been doing so far with BIM and workflows.
From empty BIM, how flexible is ISO 19650 for different size of projects, offices? Sometimes for a small project or a small office, you can't or don't need all the required rules and requirements.
Yeah, it does scale, but I can understand if you're not doing it today, then it would be a massive lift to put in place. So I would say this is like BIM. I would liken it. I would say when we were challenged early on, like 15 years ago, somebody said, I don't need BIM for the projects that I do. And they were very adamant that it was only for multi-billion-dollar projects or massive projects. And we said, no, it can work with any, but there's a learning curve. And once you've gone over that learning curve, you'll do it for anything. You know, you'll model your house. You know, that's the possibility. So they said, we don't believe you. Why not do a test project on one of our small projects? And we did a test project. This test project was a small culvert in the middle of a road. It was just a small excavation where they built something and then they put a precast slab on the top of it. And it was to divert this culvert into a different direction. And we all looked at each other. We were like, oh no, this is like probably going to end badly. But what we actually found was that there was a coordination issue between the steps going down into the culvert and this massive cutout that they put in the precast slab that goes on the top. And it would have been a total stop. So they had traffic management all over the road and they had to redo everything. So we found this and they were like, okay, yes, we now understand the power of BIM and we can do this. So it's the same principle for ISO, is if you can get over that learning curve and to understand that implementing a much more structured workflow that everyone else already understands, and slowly but surely everyone will, everyone's going to be talking the same language. It's going to make your life easier. It's more likely that you're going to communicate the exact requirements that you need. It's more likely they're going to understand what you need because you're talking in a language that they understand. And it's more likely that there's going to be less rework at the end of it and more profit for everyone. So it is, it's not a new way of doing things. That's kind of like to reinforce that. It's improving what we do today with some logical, nicely structured steps.
Yeah, so even if a small office might not necessarily use it right away or need it right away for some projects, it's good to plan for the future and start learning, maybe experiment with it, try it on a few projects so they're ready when it becomes more as a requirement.
Yeah, owners are requiring, but that's another one of those things is, what is it that owners ask for? Really, they're asking for their building at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And how you get there is up to you.
Yeah,
but
don't wait for the owner.
It's if you want to improve your workflows, then look at what you can take from the ISO work. There was a great webinar with a Portuguese firm that had implemented, it's like cherry pick the right parts and just implement those. So if you've got challenges in, let's say contract structure, then take some parts that make sense. If it's about defining information requirements, if it's about checking and workflows to establish more control over quality, just take those parts and implement them first.
All right. From FL, once again, the plan really looks good. Well done. It seems we stick to one standard. Or is there room to top up ISO 19650 with certain section of UK past standards if this is not already superseded? So I think it's a UK specific question.
The past standards really were the foundation for the ISO standards. So moving from the standards has already occurred as we've moved towards the ISO 19650 standards. So yeah, that's really, and the concept there was the past standards really to get something out as quickly as possible to support, and then to iterate, and then formalizing and internationalizing with the ISO standards has occurred. So yeah, maybe more precise question, or yeah, I'm happy as well. We don't know all of the answers, but we can certainly put you in touch with the right people. So yeah, let us know. Connect with me. Connect with one of the team members if you want to.
From BIM Doctor, what type of document, something signed, do you use to make sure all appointed parties will be obligated to follow the BEP?
So the information protocol is essentially that language that says how to use these other aspects. So you've got exchange information requirements and BIM execution planning, and then you've got an information protocol which allows you to understand. And then if I was to go into the docs section, it's a document. Unfortunately, as I'm in the free account, there's only 2 documents allowed, so I have to delete one first. But if I go into here and see the appointment documents, this document would then give you a lot of understanding of why, and the information particulars, which says this is the BIM execution plan and this is where it is, and that legal language that then is about how to follow and what clauses are, and etc. So this is the type of legal locking and language that wraps around it. And the point to this is that inside of Planoly, you would export a document that nicely cover page and then has this appointment document and the BIM execution plan, and maybe you only appoint the published sections, the content that you agree on, and then you create a PDF from that. So that kind of concept of wrapping this all together is where you get the legal language that makes it actually law, and then you get a signature on it as well in the contract set.
All right, thanks for the explanation. Looking at, there are a lot of questions. Ben Saunders asks, if we subscribe to this, is there a guarantee that you will keep up to date with the latest standards, please?
We are here to help, and one of the great things actually is that there's about I think it was 250 teams that are working on these standards, but you can join that as well and be part of the team that keeps up with them. We don't profess to say that we own this or want to hold the keys to everything, but yes, we are on that, usually on the cutting edge as far as standards go, and we support. I think that we're good to say that we are the platform that supports the most international standards and also have mapped them against each other around the world. So yeah, if history is anything to go by, then the answer should be yes, but I can only promise that we're going to do our best.
Yeah, well, I've scrolled through Planoly, and there seems to be constantly new standards. And also, well, it will answer a question from Scholar DX. Do Planoly support multiple languages for BEP? And the answer is yes. I saw, especially recently, I saw that you added in French, which I work a lot in French. I was happy to see these new templates.
Yeah, so you've got in different languages around the world so that they can be understood and communicated. The application as well, we support language inside of your profile, and these are all languages that are available for the application itself.
I'm saying that you have French Canadian, is that right? That's funny. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's interesting. It's true. There's sometimes difference between ways things are done or formulated in France and here in Canada.
It's like English UK and
exactly.
English.
Exactly. Yeah. More questions from Simone. Can I create a personal information process if I want to structure a workflow for immersive visualization. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Is it about describing it or about
Visual for immersive visualization? I think it might be related to that ability you've shown earlier. So I'm not too sure. So if you can clarify, Simone, would be good. Let's go to something else. From Russ, who do you think should put the COBie data into the model to then export? Architects and engineers should be concerned with warranty start dates, but if not in the models, you cannot just export.
Yeah, it should be the person responsible for putting information in. And when we say into the model, it might be it's referenced actually in another database rather than actually being in a model element. Should be the person responsible for that piece of information. So yeah, is the architect responsible for the warranty start date? I don't think so. It should be more the contractor or the subcontractor that is actually doing the work. And it's about connecting that workflow in a way that teams can then be usefully adding it. One of the things that we have just added as well is an export for this information delivery specification, which can actually be with an add-on imported into Revit to populate the properties into the right elements and also with the right values, so you don't have to worry about spending a lot of time managing in the properties palette. You've got your own properties palette, which is actually filtered down for what the requirements are. For example, the warranty details. So somebody else could populate that, and it would be a much easier process. But there are lots of other tools on the market to do different things in different ways.
Great. I think we went through all or almost all of the questions. So I wonder, do you have something else that you really wanted to show, or a feature of Plannerly that you're excited about that you wanted to tell us about?
I could share more about the AI piece that we have, but everyone's doing AI at the moment, so maybe that's not so important or interesting. But just to quickly share the AI piece is to say you can create a whole document just by adding a description about it. That's one. But the piece that I'm really interested in is, for us, we believe that everyone should be paid in a respectable time frame. And today in our industry, the average payment is 75 days, which I think sucks. and I think that's what causes most of businesses that have poor cash flow to go out of business. So what we are doing next at Plannerly is not just evaluating if this is done, but when somebody comes in and checks the verify box, we're actually initiating a micro payment between the two parties with a secure bank-to-bank transfer. So instead of it just being a task on a project management application, it's now tied in to contractual obligation and also to the direct incentive, which is payments. And that whole process can be, in some ways, this kind of gamification for our industry to really define what is going to happen, follow it, and then go through with it and actually get paid for it instantly, rather than when somebody says their accounting team is going to pay maybe 60 days later. So that's the big thing for us. And we're actually looking for teams around the world that want to do this, to pilot it. So if you're on the line and interested, then get in touch.
Yeah, so it's almost like some sort of a smart contract that is done with each task. Oh, interesting.
Yep.
And you've shown AI, but I'm curious, what does it do? You just enter the description and the BEP fills up automatically?
Yeah, you could do that. So you could just say, I want a contract document, and then it would just create you a complete contract. You can use that online as well, just to have a go. But if I say, for example, we've got some errors in here as well. This is kind of like a more day-to-day use case of AI. Every single one of these sections has an AI button and different options to do things. So like, for example, write my section or summarize this information, simplify. But in this one, if I hit correct it, I have to select some text. If I hit correct, it's basically going to go back, correct it for spelling, for grammar, for punctuation, for content as far as clarity as well. This follows 1 billion data points in the AEC space. So that's what it's trained on. So if you're using a term maybe and you want it explained, you can actually ask it to explain a term or expand on a term, and that will do it. And there's a bunch of other features in here as well that will work based on your understanding of how AI works. But we can see, so this basically now is corrected, but okay, what happened? We can see the versions, and this is what it then spotted and changed. So everything that you would have done or had to do manually is now updated automatically.
Yeah, and that's really cool. And what about a chatbot where you could ask the bot, hey, what is the LOD that I should have for this? Or when is the date that I should deposit that or that document? Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah, that would be cool. I love it. And so I think you're looking into our roadmap.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So there's some parts there. We've got AI that's being added to the scope for helping in task definition and checklists. And we also have AI that's being added into the model for aggregation and for checking and for automating some of that. So there's, endless possibilities. We're excited about assistive AI for sure. Yeah.
All right. So I'll just mention a few things before we close this. Give me a minute here. Okay. So again, thanks to Enscape for sponsoring this episode and the season of BIM Pure Live. And make sure to check out the Revit Pure pamphlets collection at revitpure.com/pamphlets. The goal is to take complex Revit topics and explain them as simply as possible. There's a whole collection of 29 PDFs, and pamphlet number 30 should be released within a couple of weeks, actually. And I saw that we had on the chat today Agustina, and well, she's going to be the next guest, Agustina Aboy from Slantis. She's on next week at the same time at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the name of the episode is the Collab Loop. So it's all about how to collaborate to innovate in the BIM industry efficiently. So we're going to be talking about efficient way to share and spread information among your team, including using tools such as Notion. It should be very interesting. Can't wait to hear from Tina about it. So back to you, Clive. Any final word or anything you wanted to say before we leave?
So keep it simple. I know we talked about ISO 19650. It doesn't have to be confusing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be scary. And does everyone have to read the whole thing, all of the different sections, contents? No. But in order to make it clearer, you do need to have some champions inside of companies that do understand the workflow and do understand the most important parts as it refers to them. So if you're that person, good luck. Get in touch with any one of our team as well. We can help. But because we've been on that journey, certainly, and simplify it for everyone else, because it's not doing something completely differently. It's structuring into a framework to make it easier, to make it more repeatable, and to essentially get better profits because there's less rework and waste in that workflow.
Great. So plannerly.com, if you want, well, it's a great product, but if just to explore the BIM execution plan and all the standards, it's such a great tool for that. You get the most up-to-date recent documentation in multiple language, and the resource pages that you have looks quite amazing. I'll have a look by myself for sure, especially the course that you mentioned that is not quite ready. I'll look forward to it.
Great.
So yeah, that's it. Thank you everybody, and see you next week with Agustina. Bye.
Thank you.